Hey everybody. Oh, actually, it froze there for a second. I'm going to take that again because last time it did that, I completely missed that and had to slice them together. All right, now we're good. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another exciting edition of the Security Repo Podcast. Very happy to have you here with us. Always remember to hit the like and subscribe, tell your friends, send this to everyone you know. But I'm here as your host, always, Dwayne, and joined by our always present and awesome co-host, Kazar. Hey Kazar, how you doing?
Hi everyone, doing great. How are you?
Love that shirt, man.
Thank you.
Doing good. So we're joined this week by John Poulin. He leads the team over at Cloud Security Partners. He leads their technology and platform development. John, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here today.
It's great to have you on the show today, John. Let's kick it off with something that is maybe, we haven't really defined. We never really think about it in our day-to-day work as security professionals, and that's defense in depth, because everybody understands what defense in depth is, right? At least we hope so. So, imagine for a second that I'm a junior, I'm just entering the security field, and you have to define that, to explain that to me. What would you tell me?
Yeah, so I think a lot of folks have some understanding of what defense in depth is, but it's not until you start thinking practically, what does that actually mean? How does that influence my role? That maybe there's some questions. And so I always like to reference the obligatory security onion. A lot of folks who are early in their career have seen reference to the security onion. But basically, adding more layers of security to help really make a system or a process more resilient. More layers of security to help not just prevent attackers, but also detect, monitor, respond to things of that nature. So there's a lot that goes into it. Some of it's from the code side, some of it's from the system hardening side, some of it's from the typical DevSecOps side. So what can we do when we're not just writing code, but even designing systems? What can we add for layers to make them more resilient? Yeah.
All right. So, what if your manager, your CTO, your technology leader comes in and says, "Well, I understand, John, but this new security mechanism that you are suggesting is too much. We already have a lot of other mitigating security measures, and this would be just too much." But you, in your opinion, as a security professional, absolutely think that this new mechanism should be deployed. So, what would be the arguments that you would use to convince that somewhat unconvincing or unconvinced, rather, individual?
Yeah, I mean, it's always going to be context specific, right? Depends on the situation, which is very much a cop-out answer, and I recognize that. So number one, look at what value it brings. We're not doing security just for the sake of doing security. We're not looking to pad our consulting bill to get more money. What is the value we're adding here? So you can kind of measure some of that by looking at things like past breaches. If you're internal, you may have some insight into past breaches. You may have some understanding of areas where there were gaps. For instance, if you had a SQL injection exploitation that resulted in a data dump, there are probably some things you can do to kind of harden your systems or add better logging or things of that nature. So you really have to kind of understand what metrics are available. And then also, what the budget is. If you have, a ton of P0 and P1 vulnerabilities that you have to be fixing, it might not be the best time to think about adding audit logging to your legacy application, for instance. So, you really have to kind of weigh it out and plan for it. But the talk I give called Defense in Depth Engineering, one of the things that we try to highlight is a lot of these concepts are much easier to add at the beginning of the application development life cycle. So you're bootstrapping a new application. These are the few things you should be thinking about day one that'll kind of pay back dividends. Things like audit logging, things like content security policy header. I could go on and on. So it's very much going to be, context specific. But again, finding some metrics that showcase the areas of improvement.
So definitely have questions about several things you just said there. But back at CodeMash, where I met you, part of what I really liked about your talk and presentation wasn't just Hey, defense in depth, let's raise awareness. You talked about creating tests, like actually looking at test creation as part of the incident response and how that aids with defense in depth. Hope you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to talk about that. And to kind of back up one step further, every semester I give a talk at the local university's security course. And one of the first things I do is say, raise your hands if you're writing tests as part of your application development process. No one ever puts a hand up. Like it's scary, that these folks in college are building these products and platforms for their coursework and are never really instrumenting test suites. So the first thing I like to point out is if your systems have test suites at all, you're doing a good job. And to be honest, you're doing better than a lot of companies out there. It's amazing how many folks we work with that have absolutely no test coverage at all. So first thing, like when you're writing software, make sure you have tests for it. It makes it easier to extend. It makes it easier to adopt new features, and it makes it more resilient. And so with regard to the incident response situation, I always like to say never waste a good incident. So if you've been breached or there's some vulnerability, maybe a bug bounty, reporter says, "Hey, we found some vulnerability. Here's the details." Well, the first thing obviously your team wants to do is go fix that vulnerability. You want to stop the bleeding. Super important, right? But the next step you want to think about is how do we make sure we don't reintroduce that same vulnerability through like regression? So what if, for instance, the pull request the engineer makes to fix a vulnerability has some inadvertent side effects, and someone later decides, well, this isn't working out as expected, we need to revert that change. Suddenly the application's vulnerable again. And so I always like to encourage, in many situations, I like to require what I consider security tests. So in any situation where you're fixing or addressing a security vulnerability, there should be a test that lives alongside it. And that test should test that you have remediated the vulnerability. Obviously, there are a bunch of different ways of doing this, and we don't need to get into the details there. But the idea there is that if the code change was ever reverted or the vulnerability was reintroduced, you would have that test there looking for the vulnerability, which would then fail if the application became vulnerable again. Back when I was at GitHub, this was a requirement. When we fixed vulnerabilities, we had to have test coverage that adequately covered those cases. There was a lot of detail that went into it.
This is quite interesting because some vulnerabilities can be quite easy, quote unquote, of course, to test for. Like if you've got a SQL injection, if you've got maybe an XSS, but some others could be a bit harder to uncover with an automated test. Like for example, take a race condition. If you've got that sort of thing, it gets a bit more involved. So my question for you is, how much time and effort did first off, before that, was it, I imagine, the developing team that was in charge of putting that test into their test suite, or was it the security team that had the responsibility of doing that? So that's the first question. And the second one, how much effort did you put into that? Like, if it was easy, I imagine it was no effort at all, and that would be it. But if it was more technical, did you have any occasion where you had to drop that requirement, for example?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, the way I've typically seen it work best is if the teams and the engineers responsible for the feature own those tests as well. And it's a good situation to get security in room with engineering and say, hey, let's pair on this, let's work together, and let's build this test out. Whenever you're writing a test like this, I always recommend starting with the vulnerable code and having the test in there, making sure that the code actually is vulnerable. And then when you fix it, you'll see that test status change. It's like trying to fix a vulnerability. It's easier to fix once you know how to exploit it. So the same with the test. You want to start with an exploitable case, write the test, then fix the vulnerability. And that's typically best in the hands of engineers because they know that code well. Sometimes engineers are too busy. There's a lot of pushback. If your security team is well versed enough and comfortable writing code and they feel like they could accomplish it, then that is better than nothing. But, it depends how the organization is structured to take ownership of security. And then, so your other question, yeah, I mean, of course, certain vulnerabilities are going to be easier to test. Things like race conditions are going to be hard. It's going to be hard to have a test to look for, an indicator of a race condition, in large part because tests are typically designed to be fast and also parallel. So there are other concerns to think about in that case, where you may actually have to write a test script that runs outside of your typical testing process. Maybe you have a different GitHub Actions workflow that runs on like a self-hosted runner closer to bare metal. That way you get some better metrics there. So in that case, depending on the gravity of the situation, if it was a race condition that resulted in like a critical vulnerability, in my opinion, it's worth investing the engineering effort. But then you may also want to start thinking about, are there other cases where this could be not just a security test, but could the engineers be using this test for like any performance gathering or anything of that nature as well? So can you make it more reproducible, reusable? So yeah, there are going to be cases where you're not going to want to spend, 100 hours of engineering time to write a test for a low risk race condition. So it's a balance. Yeah. And this comes back to having like a good security exceptions process. In a mature organization, you have security requirements, but you need to have exceptions to those, and having a good process where you can kind of audit those exception requests and take inventory of them. Yeah.
Actually, I want to dig into that just a little bit. So how technical and into the process, into the software development lifecycle should the security team be to accomplish this? Because it's one thing to say, hey, here's the issue. Another thing to say, hey, here's a test you could do to do that, versus in your workflow, your bottleneck is here because you're not doing the test in the right order, and let's refine that test with you in your language. Like, where are we required to meet someone?
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. And I don't think a typical security engineer would be able to look at the application holistically and say, like, you're not running this test at the right layer. There's a concept called, flaky test coverage, where sometimes tests pass, sometimes they fail, and it can be unpredictable. And we don't want that for security tests. So we want to try to avoid that, at all costs. But again, organizations have flaky tests. Some organizations have coverage of those to ensure when that's growing or not. This is not an area I would expect a typical security engineer to hop in and lend a hand. I mean, hopefully they've got some very experienced software engineers on hand that are maintaining those tests. So the way I've typically seen the handoff work best is if the security engineer triages the issue, validates it, and comes up with some example payloads, right? Maybe it's a curl command, run a curl command to hit the API and do something, or maybe it's an integration test within the platform. And that helps the engineers at least see what types of things should be tested for. The engineers will take that and they'll modify it to fit the application test suite, a little better. But I definitely would not expect there to be a tight coupling between the security engineers triaging the vulnerabilities, validating them, and then also writing the tests as well. Now, of course, in a small startup, yeah, your security engineer is probably going to be writing those tests and helping out. But, when we start looking at, medium to large size companies, there's going to be a solid delineation there.
Makes sense. Seems like there should be a little bit better alignment between pen testing and the red teamers, like for those payloads. I mean, they're literally already writing them to exploit. So maybe not giving all the developers the full pen test rundown, that would be terrifying. But like passing over, like, hey, these are what got through.
Yeah. I mean, we see that with web application firewalls, right? Web application firewalls are blocking a bunch of things, and then, hey, one or two things got through. So like, why did those get through? And understanding that, at the WAF level, obviously that's a different problem, but it's similar to what you're just describing there. We need a way to better understand what data is flowing through the systems and what we should be doing to test for it.
Yeah, if I may interject for a second, that's something that I constantly say to my team is that, we as security engineers are responsible for ensuring the best security that we can ensure within the constraints that we have. But how do we secure these systems if we don't understand them? It doesn't work. There's no point, right? Don't even try securing something if you don't understand how it works, what it's supposed to do, what data it processes, what for what people, etc. Right? So you have to understand these things before you actually start about trying to draw that potential attack graph and seeing how you can install obstacles on the attacker's path. So maybe we don't have to, and I would say we definitely don't have or need to understand the nitty-gritty details of all the apps that we are responsible for, but we should, given some time with an engineer who's working on these applications, be able to help them out, improving their security. At least that's my position on it.
Yeah, to take that one step further, one thing I like to talk with folks about is write the system, write the code as if you're not going to be there in 6 months. That way someone else can help it out, because you would want someone to do the same thing for you. If your manager, if your team lead were to leave the company, and leave you responsible for the system, you would want there to be documentation. Well, your security team wants that as well. So,
So speaking of attacks and getting security alignment with the developers, back at your talk, CodeMash, you also talked about security headers. You specifically said security headers are the new encryption. I actually wrote that down verbatim. What does that mean?
Okay, so I think you missed one part of that verbatim quote. I said security headers are the new bank grade encryption.
This is why we have people on the show, so they can correct me on these things.
Yeah. So this is what I'm pointing out here is, early 2000s, you'd go on a website, and if it was not even TLS, but if it was SSL enabled, there would be the bank, icon from Thought at the bottom that says secured with 128-bit encryption. We got so used to seeing that all over the place, but guess what? No one has that anymore. You don't see that on websites. That's not a selling point. But what was interesting is that's something as a customer you could actually validate. You could make sure your connection to that system was encrypted by looking at the TLS certificate, looking at the protocol, etc. So there was a level of transparency. Now, these days, most everything is encrypted by default, TLS, SSL, etc. It becomes pretty obvious if things aren't encrypted. Your browser makes a big fuss about it. But one thing I started to observe is I saw a lot of customers asking about security headers. And I'm like, why are these customers so interested in our security headers? And I came to realize that's the only thing they can proactively check against a website. We could go onto GitHub.com. We could go onto Salesforce, load up some of their apps and check the security headers by looking at the HTTP requests and responses. And so as a consumer, this allows us to kind of make a little bit of a decision, right? You can look at the security headers and say, well, they're having some pretty good security headers here. Maybe they have a good security team. Maybe I trust them with my personal information. Maybe I trust them with my social security number. On the flip side, though, if you go to the website and you're not seeing any security headers, well, I personally probably wouldn't trust them to consume my data. So it allows me to make a slightly informed decision. And so, as a consumer of websites on the internet, I typically like to look at security headers. It's kind of like a pet project of mine as I'm browsing around the internet. And I know a lot of folks in enterprises, when they're purchasing or procuring software from new vendors, they are looking at the security headers and they're asking questions and trying to make decisions about them based on their answers. Securityheaders.io, check it out. You can load any website, look at the security headers. They'll give you a number grade, basically A+ through F. It's pretty interesting if you haven't played around with it.
I definitely agree with you on the fact that security headers provide a sort of um, estimation, if you will, of the company's security posture. Like if you have none of them, that's obviously a big problem. But I'm curious to have your opinion on the real correlation between very strong security header posture and actual security posture, because a company can just invest a few engineering hours into having the best grade on securityheaders.io, right, and then do practically nothing in the back end with the things that you can't really see and that can have a big security impact. So would you say that a B grade, for example, is really much worse than an A plus grade on securityheaders.io?
Yeah, I mean, so these ratings are changing as new headers are added and removed. I'm less interested in the grade itself and more interested in what headers are actually being set. There's a couple in particular I tend to care about more than others. Strict transport security is a header I care about, and then content security policy is another header I care about. If, in my opinion, if they have a strong content security policy, this indicates that they are very, very unlikely to have a cross-site scripting vulnerability on their website. And if they've gone to the lengths of engineering their system to have a strong content security policy, I generally assume they're doing pretty good in other areas as well, because it's not necessarily an easy lift. So you're right, though. There may be no correlation at all, right? It's no different than having TLS, secured website being advertised and then not mitigating SQL injection. You don't really know, but at least having TLS is good, right?
Yeah, definitely. All right, switching gears for a second, let's talk about something I enjoy quite a bit, and these are audit logs. I am sure that you have a lot of opinions on these. So tell us your take about audit logs.
Yeah. So first of all, as a consumer, I love audit logs. Audit logs are effectively consumer-facing logs that indicate what actions have been taken, by an actor, against a target, including things like IP addresses in some cases. And so, what this provides to a consumer is the ability to understand what is going on in my account or in my organization, and it provides the same insight into an organization. So, for instance, I'll talk about GitHub's audit logs because that's kind of what I'm most familiar with. At GitHub, we had a lot of organizations asking us questions. Maybe they'd gone through some type of data breach. They wanted to know what the threat actors did with the compromised accounts. And way back in the day, it was a matter of digging through Splunk logs and trying to make sense of, the HTTP requests that had been going on. And that wasn't always tenable. Obviously, that's a lot of engineering and support overhead to formulate those. And so the idea was, these are actions taken on behalf of a user or an organization. They should be exposed so that the user or organization can surface them themselves. And so, generally speaking, started understanding that folks care most about understanding what type of data was accessed and what happened with that data. And so you can engineer systems in ways that make it easier to surface this type of data. Audit retroactively instrumenting audit logging into an application, that can be challenging. But again, this is an area where if you're building it from the ground up, design it with audit logging in mind, and then understand that it's going to be easier for users to be able to surface that information. Yeah, I think I saw your hand go up, Dwayne.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, that's an internal thing to let you know. I had a question on that. I know you had pretty strong opinions about this. This was one of I think the whole room got a little bit of not a chuckle, but appreciation out of when you talked about it. But you talked about a wall of shame of companies that don't provide these logs. They're like, the value of these is innumerable. Like so much security is looking at the logs and figure out what happened. But
Yep.
what is this wall of shame? Like, what are people getting wrong about this?
Yeah. So There's the website called Audit Log Wall of Shame. I never remember the URL. I Google it every time. Audit Log Wall of Shame. There's a similar website for SSO Wall of Shame as well. And the idea is to list companies that have audit log support and either have gaps in their coverage or maybe just indicate like, hey, they're charging you enterprise rates for this. So if you care about data security, you need to be on the enterprise plan. So as someone who works with a lot of startups, what I'm thinking is, okay, these folks can't afford enterprise audit logging payments. So we need to find options that fit into their budget. So I typically recommend folks who are in purchasing positions to take a look at the audit log wall of shame and find solutions that will have coverage to meet your needs that fit into your budget. And so if you're to look at the site, you'll see, it does talk about like what sort of like support level, which translates to money, basically, what sort of money you have to pay to get the audit logging support, and then also what gaps are in there. So some of the gaps may be like there's no audit logging coverage on the API, only on the web interface. Okay, well, what does that give us from a security perspective? The threat actor is just going to do bad things on the API, and then we're not going to have the coverage there. So it's definitely a name and a shame type of website. But if you're making decisions and looking for software, it's a really good way to get informed. Then on the flip side, if you're designing the software, it's good to think about the things that users are expecting,
And we will link these in the show notes, but it is audit-logs.tax and sso.tax. I didn't realize tax was a top-level domain, but here we are.
Here we are.
Yeah, speaking of designing secure applications with audit logs, as far as I'm aware, frameworks like Django or I don't know what other backend frameworks exist outside of the Python world because I'm a Python guy. Anyway, but take Django or Flask, for example. They do not provide audit logs out of the box, do they? Is that correct?
Oh yeah, that's very correct. And in fact, I'm working with a few customers right now who are working in Flask, and it's been kind of a pain in the butt to design the system for centralized audit logging. So you're spot on. This is not something I found an out-of-the-box solution for. In fact, most of the time, folks are having to build them kind of organically, so to speak.
So in that situation, wouldn't it make sense for companies who are building these bespoke solutions to ask for more money for them, in a way?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not against the idea of asking for more money for things like this, and same with SSO. When you start adding SSO support to your application, engineering costs go up, support costs go up. Someone has to pay for it, right? So same with audit logging. It's not a free feature. It takes engineering time, it takes design time, it takes security testing time as well. So yeah, I mean, someone's got to pay for it. But then I'm also of the mindset that if it's there and if it's already running, why not just expose it to folks anyways? Like, see, I'm kind of anti-subscription model for things. Like I have a car that has a subscription model attached to it. And I absolutely hate that. I mean, all the hardware is in the car already. Why do I have to pay monthly for you to just activate it? So I go back and forth because I very much see both sides. And I think kind of where I stand to reason is maybe it should be a subscription feature with a low barrier to entry, right? With logging in general, the cost there is data storage. So if folks want us to store their data for the audit logging coverage, maybe $2 a month is enough to cover that. I'm not sure what the dollar amount is, but yeah.
If you think about it, it's already likely that the audit logs are there and they're just not exposed to the individual user. And I honestly 100% agree with you. One thing that I would like to see with SaaS applications and software vendors, generally speaking, is a sort of smaller bundling of features, if that makes sense. Like, I may want this feature and that feature, and I don't care about all the enterprise features. I just want audit logs or maybe IP restrictions, or what, it doesn't really matter what it is. And let me just have that, and I'll pay you extra for it. I just don't want the entire package, right? And that's not something that we're seeing today, unfortunately.
No, I was just dealing with this recently with a product. It's they try to offer 3 tools in one, and I only wanted 2 of the tools.
Yep.
But there was no way to just have 2 tools. There was no discount for just having 2 tools. It's limited, but also as I'm building these systems, I understand how hard it can be to decouple and use feature flags or something similar behind certain services. It's a hard thing to engineer.
Yeah, definitely understand. All right, well, it's been great chatting with you today, John. Let's now move on to arguably my favorite part of the show, the one where we ask all our guests the same 4 questions. So let's kick it off with, what is your favorite security-focused command line tool?
Security focused command line tool. Okay. I'm going to come out of left field a little bit. And while it's not necessarily security focused, it is a tool I use very often in security engagements, and it is called Regress. Have either of you used Regress before?
I am a fan of Silvercester myself.
So, a lot of what I do through incident response is identify patterns and then try to find other instances of those patterns. And a lot of that comes down to running some nasty grep commands with regular expressions and weeding through that. And so I found ripgrep I've been using for a couple of years. It's extremely fast. It's quick. It's optimized. It runs very smoothly on my Mac. And when I say smoothly, what I mean is it basically consumes all of my computer's resources to find whatever it's looking for, which, depending on what you're trying to do, that may or may not be a good thing. But when I'm trying to look for a particular pattern or vulnerability or set of credentials across a large code base, I want to find that as soon as I can. And ripgrep has been really great getting that done, for me, substantially faster than grep itself in similar tools. So I like to bring that up because a lot of folks have not used it. They've not looked to alternatives for grep, and that's the one I've had success with.
Let me reassure you, John, you're not the first person to say that either ripgrep or another type of grep is their favorite security command line tool. And I definitely understand your point. I've moved to Silvercenter myself because I just find the user interface much nicer.
Yeah.
Right, moving on. What is your go-to question when hiring for security positions?
I don't think I necessarily have a go-to question. But one of the things I try to understand very early on into the conversation is what level of passion does this person have? Because security is a very tough industry to be in if you plan on being kind of stagnant with your own personal development. So what is this person doing? How much interest do they have in security as a whole? I mean, I tend to place a little more value on candidates that are spending some of their own free time researching, hacking things, building services, deploying services, things of that nature. And so I try to weed out early on, how much of a hobby was security for them before they made it their career, because that's when you find folks that are really passionate about security, and they're not just in it for the paycheck and the day to day. And then obviously, every candidate's going to be a little different. When you're interviewing them, they're going to tell you what they think you want to hear. So you have to kind of skirt around it a little bit to get to an honest set of answers.
All right. Maybe arguably our most famous part of the show at this point. Good advice, worst advice. What's the best advice you're hearing out in the world around security? Like the best advice you're given, the best advice you've heard in recent memory. It's floating around out there. Let's start with the good.
Yeah. So starting with good advice, use whatever tools you need to get the job done. As someone who's worked at an organization that sells security tools, I understand there's a need to reach out and use competitive tools on occasion, because that is what is most important to the job. we need the tools we need to get the job done, to make sure our systems are secure. And sometimes that's not necessarily the tools we're building and trying to sell as well. So being flexible. I've never found a good like one size fits all type of tool or type of package. So a lot of times it is making use of multiple different tool sets. Yeah. So yeah, if your security budget is allowing you to onboard one vendor or one tool, you're going to want to start thinking about what gaps they're not providing, and then try to find budget to cover those gaps at some point in the near future.
All right, back to defense in depth. Make sure you're covering all areas, because after all, the A in CIA triad is availability, and if you're not making it available, if you're not actually delivering the thing, you're not really doing security. So I'll ask, what's your opinion? What's the worst security advice floating out there right now?
I don't know if this is still advice, but this is something, unfortunately, I have a few clients who have fallen into this trap of just putting a web application firewall in front of it. I think one of the things that came out of Log4j is a lot of the WAF vendors, they did a good job getting rules out pretty early to help mitigate some of the exploitation. Now, of course, there were bypasses, things of that nature. And a lot of folks look to WAFs as like the solution in that case. And I still see it. I still do a lot of incident response work with customers that have web application firewalls. And more often than not, they work pretty well. But one time out of 100, if you're able to find a bypass for a SQL injection vulnerability and exploit it, well, the WAF didn't provide a whole lot of value. So again, this comes back to tooling. Don't spend your entire security budget on a web application firewall, for instance. It is a layer of defense. So defense in depth, throw a web application firewall on it. That's buying you some protection. It's buying you some monitoring, but that can't be your only layer. So that's kind of the worst advice I've been, dealing with lately, is folks who are just going all in on things like web application firewalls and intrusion prevention. Yeah.
It points to that there's still a number of people. I wouldn't say it's the majority, but there's still a number of people that are still clinging on to the protected network, that there's a zone that's going to be safe as you're inside.
Yeah.
I haven't lived in that world in quite a while. I don't think.
Yeah, exactly. Welcome to SSRF. So,
well, John, thank you so much for being on the show. We could do a whole other episode. Because you were at GitHub the day that you rotated or logged everyone out of the system.
Yeah.
Don't really tell the whole story, but what happened?
Yeah, so that was, I think, back in 2021, and I want to say I was actually on PTO that day, and so I think I just happened to check my phone and see what was going on. But yeah, so TLDR, there was a day where GitHub had to forcibly log out every single one of the users. Now, this, you obviously take notice, because many of the folks who are using GitHub, they're not logging out regularly. Sessions will last, they don't expire. So you wake up one morning, you've got to write a pull request, you're not logged in. Pretty noticeable. So behind the scenes, what had happened is a customer had kind of written in and said, hey, we're logged in, but we're seeing another customer's data here. What is going on? And so obviously security got looped in very early on that. And, I wasn't in the room exactly when this happened, but I would imagine, a lot of folks were going down different rabbit holes trying to figure out what was going on. So GitHub released a blog post later on that goes into some detail about it. And it's hard to even call it a vulnerability. But, the bug effectively was in some of I think it was the rack middleware. So the web server middleware had some shared state that was being shared across certain HTTP requests. And it was a vulnerability or a bug that only existed for like a month or two and had very, very low impact. High impact, but low likelihood of it happening. There was only a few customers that were actually impacted. But, GitHub early on decided we're going to force everyone to log out. We're destroying all sessions because we don't want customers to be affected this way. So interesting thing. And the reason I bring it up in the defense and in-depth engineering talk is to get folks thinking about, like, when we're building a login system, what were to happen if we had to revoke sessions for all of our users? And what does that look like at scale? Because this was not something that happened in seconds. This was something that happened in the order of hours. And it required a lot of database hits and a lot of engineering time and a lot of risk, because what if we did it wrong? You know what I mean? So it's a fun story to think about. It's something that, GitHub has been very transparent on in the blog. I recommend checking that out.
I think we might have slightly different definitions of fun.
Yeah. Yeah, a little Stockholm syndrome, I guess.
Well, man, thank you very much for being here, for sharing your knowledge with us. Is there anything else you want to give a shout out to out there, or where can we follow your adventures, or any last bits of advice you want to give us?
Well, I think next time I talk to you all, maybe we should do it on my podcast, which is Cocktails and Cloud. I don't know if you consume alcohol or not. Clearly, I do occasionally, but we run a little bit of a podcast where we talk about cloud security, things of that nature. I'm sure you both have some great insight there, so I'd love to get you all to come on at some point and talk through that.
That's the nice thing about Remote Remote, is you have no idea what I'm drinking. This is water, but
exactly. Yeah, I'm drinking a green tea right now.
All right. Well, Kezar, any final remarks?
Well, it's been great having you on the show today, John, and I really wish I could have the same foresight as you, and taking PTO the day my company has a security incident.
It's happened to me twice. It's happened to me twice, and people are getting suspicious of me.
I would too.
Log4j was the other one. I was on PTO the day Log4j was announced.
I was not on PTO. I remember that day. It was not fun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks very much for being here. And again, everybody, remember to like, subscribe, tell your friends. If you didn't like the show at all, send it to your enemies. And we'll see you next time on the Security Repo Podcast. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having me.